A single apple can spark a thought. I'm Edwin.
What if the end of a war does not mean the end of an energy crisis? Many people assume that once the conflict in the Middle East cools down, oil prices will quickly fall back. But the reality may be much more complicated. The global oil market is not only reacting to headlines, it is reacting to lost supply, damaged infrastructure, uneven reserves, and the slow transmission of energy costs into the real economy. Today, let's look at a possible black swan event, one that may already be forming: a prolonged global oil shock. According to estimates cited from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, global strategic oil inventories stood at around 2.5 billion barrels by the end of 2025. But this number should not be confused with total underground oil reserves, and it should not be confused with all commercial inventories in the world. It refers mainly to strategic oil inventories, the emergency buffer held by governments and some state-linked entities. At first glance, this sounds like a huge safety cushion, but there is an important problem. These reserves are not evenly distributed, and not all of them can be freely used in a crisis. A large share is held by only a few countries, especially China, the United States, and Japan. This means that many other countries have much thinner buffers against a sudden supply shock. So the key question is not simply, how much oil does the world have in storage? The real question is, how much usable oil is available? Where is it located? And how quickly can it be released? The common market assumption is simple. Once the conflict ends, oil prices should fall. But this assumption may be too optimistic. The market often assumes that once the fighting stops, oil prices will quickly normalize. But energy supply is not like a switch that can simply be turned back on. Oil fields need workers. They need equipment. They need power systems, export terminals, pipelines, insurance, shipping access, and functioning refineries. If any part of this chain is damaged, supply may remain constrained even after the military conflict cools down. This is why the end of a war does not necessarily mean the end of an energy crisis. Natural gas supply disruptions can also have a delayed impact. When gas, refined products, and petrochemical inputs are affected at the same time, the shock spreads beyond crude oil. This is why the crisis should not be understood only as a short-term oil price spike. It could become a broader energy and industrial supply shock. Because oil inventories and energy import structures vary greatly from country to country, the impact of a supply shock will not be evenly distributed. Since March, some countries in South and Southeast Asia have already faced rising fuel supply pressure. For example, Bangladesh experienced fuel rationing and panic buying. Malaysia, meanwhile, said it was closely monitoring domestic fuel supply and paying attention to how the situation around the Strait of Hormuz could affect its energy import security. In Europe, aviation fuel risk has also attracted attention. The United Kingdom adjusted related rules to give airlines more flexibility in handling flight schedules if fuel shortages occur. Italy also stated that its aviation fuel imports had been affected by the Middle East situation. Existing stocks could support airport operations until around the end of May, although the country had not declared a full emergency. Singapore, and other economies that rely heavily on imported energy and refining trade, may also face higher external supply risks. If tensions around the Strait of Hormuz continue to worsen, Singapore's energy security, refinery operations, and regional refined product supply chains could come under further pressure. The key point is this: a global oil shock does not hit every country at the same time. And it does not hit every country with the same intensity. It spreads unevenly. First, through vulnerable importers. Then, through transportation. Then, through petrochemicals. Then, through agriculture. And eventually, through consumer prices. Oil is not only about gasoline. It is also embedded in modern life, in plastics, synthetic rubber, synthetic fibers, fertilizers, packaging materials, animal feed additives, and industrial chemicals. When oil, natural gas, and refined products become scarce or expensive, the shock moves downstream. First, producers face higher input costs. Then, chemical products become more expensive. Then, agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and consumer goods begin to feel the pressure. This is how an oil shock can slowly turn into a broader commodity shock. Methionine is one example. It is an important feed additive used in livestock production. If its price rises sharply, the immediate impact may appear in the feed industry. But over time, the pressure can move into meat, poultry, and food prices. Sulfur is another key example. The Middle East plays an important role in sulfur exports, and sulfur is crucial for producing sulfuric acid, which is used in fertilizers, mining, and chemical production. Unlike oil, many countries do not hold large strategic sulfur reserves. So when sulfur supply is disrupted, the shortage can appear faster, and it can spread into fertilizers, metals, agriculture, and basic chemical industries. This is how an energy shock becomes a commodity shock, and this is how a commodity shock can eventually become an inflation shock. However, even if the oil shock is serious, an economic crisis may not happen immediately. There is usually a transmission lag. Large companies often have long-term energy contracts. This means they may not feel the full impact of higher energy prices right away. At first, they may absorb the cost. Or they may delay price increases in order to protect market share. But once cheaper energy contracts expire and production costs rise, companies may be forced to increase prices. Then households face higher living costs. Demand starts to weaken. Companies' balance sheets come under pressure. Banks begin to see more credit risk. Financial institutions reduce leverage. Credit tightens. And then the pressure moves from the commodity market into the financial system. This is why a major oil shock may not trigger an immediate economic crisis, but it can slowly build the conditions for one. There is an interesting historical comparison. Before the 2008 financial crisis fully erupted, oil prices surged dramatically. High energy costs contributed to demand destruction, while the financial system was already fragile. Of course, history never repeats perfectly. Today's situation is different, but the mechanism is worth watching. First, energy prices rise. Then, costs spread through the economy. Then, demand weakens. Then, financial stress becomes visible. By the time central banks start cutting rates aggressively, the market may think relief is coming, but in some cases, rate cuts are not a sign of strength. They are a sign that liquidity stress has already arrived. So, what should we watch next? First, watch physical shortages, not just oil prices. If fuel, jet fuel, petrochemicals, sulfur, fertilizers, and key industrial inputs continue to tighten, that may be more important than daily oil price movements. Second, watch inventory data. The issue is not only how much oil exists globally, the issue is where it is stored and whether it can be released quickly. Third, watch inflation expectations. If energy-driven inflation rises again, central banks may find it harder to cut interest rates. Fourth, watch signs of demand destruction. When high prices begin to reduce consumption, pressure may shift from commodities to corporate earnings, credit markets, and household spending. Finally, watch the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve begins cutting interest rates aggressively while energy-driven inflation is still a problem, investors should be careful. Rate cuts are not always bullish. Sometimes they mean liquidity stress has already entered the system. In that case, the market may celebrate lower rates at first, but the deeper message could be that credit conditions are deteriorating.
The black swan may not appear as one dramatic event. It may appear step by step. First, as a shipping disruption, then as an oil shortage, then as a chemical shortage, then as inflation, then as demand destruction, and finally, as financial stress. The danger is not only that oil prices may rise. The danger is that the global economy may be forced to adjust to a longer and more physical energy constraint. So the real question is not, will oil prices fall when the headlines calm down? The real question is, has the global economy already entered the early stage of a prolonged energy shock? If you found this analysis useful, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this oil shock will fade quickly? Or are we witnessing the early stage of a much larger crisis?